Hey, this is Boaz. Thanks for showing up. Please visit the Fools and Sages podcast at foolsandsagespodcast.com. There are no spaces and it's all spelled out. You can find show notes, references, bios, merch, and other cool features. Contact us if you have feedback or a question, if you want to appear on the show, or if you want either or both of us to be a guest on your podcast. You can listen and subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, Apple Podcasts, iHeart Podcasts, and anywhere else great podcasts are found. And follow us on X and Instagram. Support us on Patreon. The Patreon link's also in our website. And thank you. Enjoy the show. Hi, welcome to the Fools and Sages podcast. I'm Boaz, and very excited today to have Claudia Hauer as a guest with us. And Brian, you found Claudia, and we had some really interesting preliminary conversations together. I'm super excited about where we're going here. Why don't you kick us off and introduce her?
I'm so excited to be able to have this conversation. And Claudia is Dr. Hauer is a tutor at St. John's College, and St. John's is a school that has two campuses, one in Annapolis, Maryland, and one here in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I've been honored to darken both of the hallways of both of those institutions. And so I'm real excited. St. John's is really a very special look. In the on the Fools and Sages podcast, we talk about philosophy and psychology and trying to make meaning out of the things that we see around us. And so I feel like Claudia gives us a real unique opportunity to explore this, the tradition of it, and also the unique institution that St. John's represents in that light. Without much further ado, Claudia, can you give us a little of your background and what got you to St. John's, and why would a person? I should have mentioned that your doctorate is in classics and Greek studies, modern Greek studies. And so I'm curious to what brought you to classics in this world, this modern scenario.
Well, thank you for having me. What an exciting time to talk with you guys. Yeah, so I did an undergrad degree at the University of Chicago, and in my junior year, I took an introductory to ancient Greek class. And when I graduated, I always had it in my head that that was the one thing I had not done well, was learn Greek. So, kind of life, the path of life took me to Minneapolis. Followed my college boyfriend there, and when he was accepted to UPenn to do a master's, and I decided I was just gonna stay, and I enrolled at the University of Minnesota and did a PhD in classics, so that I could feel that I had really finished what I had started. It was great. I mean, I got to read, Plato's Phaedrus in the original, and to a, to a 23-year-old, that was just like spiritual nourishment. And then I finished the PhD and woke up the next morning and realized the last thing I wanted to do was spend the whole rest of my life teaching other people Greek. So I had these two friends in the department, and they were like, check out St. John's. And so I did, and I ended up at St. John's College on the Santa Fe campus. The St. John's program is an all-required 4-year undergraduate program. It's all required in the sense that every student takes 4 years of language, 4 years of mathematics, 3 years of science, and 4 years of the seminar discussions that take us all the way through the history of ideas, starting with Homer and ending in the 21st century. I really felt like my education began at St. John's. It's such a holistic program, bringing together so many disciplines. It's very much discussion and experience based. So we call ourselves tutors. even though we are technically professors by the terms of academia, we call ourselves tutors because we think the books are the teachers, are the real teachers. And we are there to do our best to make sure we have a really deep and thought-provoking conversation about the books.
Mhm. So I just wanted to mention that you mentioned that the classes at St. John's are discussion classes, and within the Greek tradition, there is this a polarity, I guess, between rhetoric and dialect. And so, for most people, you might not be familiar with that. Rhetoric is just the straight exposition of a topic, like a lecture,
Mm.
which is what most students would be used to when they go to a normal university. But dialectic, particularly in the St. John's setting, but I think we're also in the Fools and Sages podcast in general. We've discovered this role that dialogue can have, that whole other things can be revealed through that process. Is it fair to say that? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we don't tell our students what to think. We listen to them and follow the threads of their ideas. And some of my most formative experiences have been with students who challenged thoughts or opinions that I had that I thought were sacrosanct. I remember early on in my time here, I encountered I always held Socrates in reverence. I was like, why would anybody ever challenge Socrates? Like, amazing. And we read something, and we read the Meno, and he was like, I think Socrates is kind of a jerk, and I think he's probably wrong. And I kind of drew in a breath, and everyone in the room was kind of like, well, let's explore that. And I realized, like, St. John's is going to challenge. We're not here to just push our thoughts over on people. We're here to follow any thread that can be backed up with, evidence from the text. We don't allow just wild personal opinions in the classroom. But
Mhm.
but yeah, dialectic definitely seems quite rare in academia. These days, I think people go to college to kind of load themselves up with whatever information is being uploaded. In,
See, in myself, I have a personal, like, an allergy to textbooks, to the textbook industry, to the presupposition of many textbooks, and that is just what you mentioned. It's this is what it is, memorize this, and then, pass it on the test. Whereas at St. John's, we wrestle with things in a different way that's much more akin to the way we wrestle with important questions in our real lives.
Mhm,
Because that's one of the things that I'm interested in. We talk here, we try to make philosophy and psychology and religious insights accessible to people.
mhm,
Um, so I'm interested in the way I know at St. John's we talk about critical thinking, because in that discussion, you don't just toss things out, you kind of have to support it. You
mhm.
kind of have to reveal your thought process a little bit in that, and dialogue helps us do that. Do you have anything on that?
Yeah, I think a program like St. John's teaches us how to think. And once we know how to think, we can think about anything. So we often say of our students, we want them to develop intellectual courage, by which we mean we want them to be able, even though, they're like, oh, maybe I don't think of myself as very good at math, but we're going to challenge them. We're going to be like, well, you have to study Euclid. And, and by helping them kind of make more accessible to themselves the way their own minds explore ideas. Hopefully, they're going to gain that kind of courage to throw them at some new topic and give them a way through it. Give them a way to kind of recognize themselves learning it, which I think is really unique.
Mhm. So it's learning how to learn as well as learning how to think.
Yeah, yeah,
And maybe
yeah,
the way they're tangled
yeah.
together, because
Right,
neither one works really well without the other, does it?
right. And people are always like, oh, um, how is St. John's relevant or to their future career? And it's like, well, we think our graduates can do anything, and in fact, today's world is going to force any college graduate to learn a lot of new things as the paradigms of technology and such like are changing so fast. And we think our students are like really well equipped because they know how to look at something new and approach
Right.
it systematically.
Well, and there's an interesting thing I think there that's relevant to higher education today, and that is maybe the distinction between career training and more of a classical education, which is really opposed to the idea of training a specific career. And I think this goes back. I think they used to call it the studia humanitatis. It's like the roots of the humanities, with the idea that literally, if you're rooted in these things, then you
Mhm.
can face anything that you need to face. And I think that liberal arts or the humanities took a real hit when there was this perception that people that studied science and technology, well, they're going to make a lot more money.
Mhm.
And so don't worry about higher thoughts, worry about making more money.
Mhm.
But I think now in this time of hyper novelty,
Mhm.
we might see that you can easily specialize in something that isn't relevant in 3 years, at least maybe the way it was, and that you're
Mhm.
gonna actually have to keep moving forward and adapting, and this idea of temporality, right? That we'll get left behind if we don't keep moving with it. Does that change the context that St. John shows up in today, maybe? Are we at a little revolution of thinking about thinking or teaching?
Well, I think that I agree. I mean, I hope that that is a revolution in the making. It is I think, an amazing education. I guess I'm thinking about what you said about making money. And I know, one thing we start with, well, we start the freshman year with Homer's Iliad and Homer's Odyssey, but we very quickly begin to look at the original ancient Greek philosophers. And I think one thing that students see early on in their freshman year is that philosophy asks us to question assumptions we take for granted in the material world that we're brought up in. And maybe, I don't know, maybe, I mean, obviously, we want our students to succeed economically. But one of the things philosophy challenges us is to ask, what are some of the most important things in a human life? And money doesn't actually hold up terribly well, um, as a kind of as a kind of nourishment to the human spirit.
Yeah, or
And it's
transcendent value of any kind.
yeah, and it's philosophy that kind of teaches us that questions like, is there a God? What are the highest moral principles? What is the good? What is beauty? It's those kinds of questions that philosophy teaches us to ask. And as I said, of course, I hope our students are going to go out into the world and have every material benefit they might desire. But we have to recognize that as that's the material world. And I guess part of my concern about higher education today is that the whole conversation is now focused on material prosperity, and I think we have kind of lost our ability to return to those deep questions of the human spirit. Um, regardless of how our students answer them, we're not a Christian college, or we inherited our name St. John's, but we actually do this really unique thing where we bring, people of all different faiths, or even people who consider themselves atheist or agnostic. We bring them all together and ask them all to have the conversation together about the greatest sort of questions of the human spirit. It's really a
Right,
beautiful thing. Yeah.
right. And St. John's is, in both campuses, there's not even quite 800 students. So that makes it really a sort of a community that's not really possible in a much larger setting. Um, another fascinating thing about St. John's, I did find, through my research here, that St. John's has been rated at number 9 for the best undergraduate teaching. It's rated as one of the top colleges, and number 5 for the best classroom experience, which I would associate with this dialectic process of not being fed truth, but being taught how to process experience and bring it into truth.
Hmm.
Um, so we've got a really small, close college here that started out in 1696 as King William School in Annapolis. So basically, after 328 years, you've got this final product that's got us into the top colleges. So now, is it true the rumors that St. John's was the inspiration for Hogwarts?
Huh. I have actually never heard that. I think
Okay.
there is a lot about St. John's that is like Hogwarts in that the kind of people we're looking for among the faculty are people who are going to be seen as weirdos by kind of standardized academia because we're not just driven to pursue one discipline. We don't just publish or perish. Like we are driven as intellectuals to ask those really hard questions. So sometimes I do kind of think of my colleagues as like all those misfit professors that Dumbledore assembles at Hogwarts. Like he knows they need a home, right? Like the world doesn't quite have a place for them, and I don't know. I mean, that those are my worst. I mean, mostly I really love my colleagues, but you do see their idiosyncrasies because we're all studying everything. We're all just jumbled together studying everything. So even though I have a PhD in classics, I could pipe up about science, and one of my science trained colleagues could pipe up about something Greek, and there we have it.
I won't ask you who is Snape.
Claudia, I'm curious about some of the comments that actually both you and Brian made about the role of liberal arts education in teaching students how to think, teaching learners how to learn, and the while STEM might have gotten more attention because it might be easier to connect to making money. There are kind of two statements made here about liberal arts. One is, well, in the future economy, probably being able to think and being able to learn are going to be really important for making money. And two, making money might not be as important as we've been making it. And I fully agree with both of those. But there's this other thing about liberal arts that's the main narrative that I'm exposed to, and I wonder if you're exposed to it and what you think about it. That liberal arts education or the academy has sort of been ideologically captured, and that academia has largely become an echo chamber for let's say ways of looking at the world that I want to say are oppressive, and we can get into kind of what that is, but I imagine you know what that looks like from inside, and I also imagine St. John's is different. And I'm
Mhm.
curious, and I imagine St. John's is different because of what you just said about kind of
Mhm.
mimicking Hogwarts, wanting students to learn directly from the material, and seeing the role of tutors at St. John's as uh, being open to being challenged. And you mentioned some of your most formative experiences being having smart kids see or interpret material differently than you had seen before. So I'm just kind of curious how you see St. John's relative to academia in general, and whether you see this ideological capture in academia in general, and is that kind of part of what you think the future for which we're preparing by teaching people how to think will entail?
Mhm. Yeah, I think we live in a very perilous age for higher education in America. Um, and we can kind of circle back to capture, I think, maybe some of what we see as the sort of developments over the centuries and millennia that maybe have brought us to this place. But what we do see is that higher education, anything post-secondary in the US, for the most part, much of it is very politicized. The rhetoric around it is very politicized. The Catholics want to send their kids to Catholic colleges. There's all this politicization now of anti-Semitism or being anti-Arab. It's and so there's a kind of way, I guess, I don't know, like the thought police, I guess, are at work. I don't know if that kind of is what you meant. Like, it seems like the thought police are at work. Um, and again, I would emphasize that at St. John's, we don't have thought police. Um, Again, as long as someone can back up their point by sound textual reference, i.e., they're talking about the book that's on the table in the classroom, we don't have thought police. I mean, we insist on civility, and we also insist on what we call staying at the table. So there's no cancel culture, right? If ideas are unpopular, you can't just walk away. You have to find a way, sitting at the table, to make the seminar discussion continue to work. And we work with our students a lot on the kinds of skills that it's going to take to overcome those moments when they feel like, oh, I don't like this other person in my classroom, or oh, this other person in my classroom is making comments that I find offensive because they're taking a side on what I think of as a politicized issue. We have to work with our students, and we have to say, whoa, slow down, back up. We needed to work on how we are going to make a conversation reach each other across those kinds of like, dislike. And I think in much of higher education, students are today, in America at least, are buffered from that. They can hide in the back of lecture rooms. They don't have to listen to their fellow students. So they're not it's not right in their face that they might have someone in the room who holds a different view than they do. Um, and it does seem like it gets more and more just about the economics of I used to work for the accreditation agency that we have, the Higher Learning Commission, and they're always talking about how education is delivered. And I'm like, I don't really think education is delivered, right? Education is something you have to incredibly work at, and work out with other people, and work out how to navigate the incredible aggravations that can arise in today's, people have strong feelings about what's happening around the world or in this own country. And um, for the most part, we don't address those things directly in the classroom. But last year, I had a sophomore seminar, and I had a Muslim woman, a Muslim woman who brought a lot of anger over what had happened in Gaza. And so it wasn't direct. It's not like we were talking about Gaza, but we still had to find a way to navigate it and to keep her in the conversations that we were having. We were reading, I guess the reason I mentioned sophomore, we were reading first a lot of Old Testament and then a lot of Romans, not Romans from the Bible, but Roman literature. And she was like, rape and plunder, like, and so she was finding ways into the books that were a little more provocative than maybe many of her classmates wanted. But we had to find a way to make it work. And I think that, in terms of civil discourse in the political arena in this country, that is just terrifying, the way people are just walking away or raising their voices as soon as they hear anything they don't agree with.
And it almost seems like the St. John's process could provide a kind of an immunity to that. I hear these things thrown back and forth in common culture, and as a Johnny, I often feel insulted that anyone would think that I would operate with such a low resolution model.
Right.
Yeah, right? I mean, it's like, right or wrong, you're going to have to hit me with more sophistication than that,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know?
yeah.
And so I do think there's almost a prophylactic effect in this learning. I also sort of feel like philosophy in the broadest terms, philia, love, sophia, wisdom, is sort of like a long, often we refer to the great conversation through history.
Mhm.
And it really is kind of about the human's dialogue with the unknown.
Mhm.
And I think that when we engage with that authentically, it creates a sort of a humility in us
Mhm.
when we stand before the unknown.
Mhm.
And that somehow philosophy through time has sort of tried to help us get guidelines for how we operate with the unknown. Does that feel fair to say as a general starting place for philosophy? I mean, I feel like philosophy started as sort of like a very broad, let's get wise about everything. And now, as we've gone through history, we've kind of focused in on parts and sort of parsed it more specifically.
Yeah, that's great. And if you look at how philosophy kind of was born in the West, in Greece, there are many strands. It began in this pre-Socratic age with a kind of metaphysical speculation. Metaphysics is like when you begin to wonder why are things the way they are, um, or what's beyond the physical, literally metaphysical, right? What's after the physical?
Mhm.
So you see those kinds of questions, speculations about the nature of what's real. And then there's also, of course, moral philosophy, which Plato kind of gave birth to when he kind of had this character Socrates go up and interrogate interlocutors, and he'd be like, "Well, what do you think justice is?" Or, "What do you think the good is?" And the people would answer based on whatever their parents had taught them, like what a good Athenian would think or something, and he'd be like, well, actually, I see some problems in that answer. Could we probe further? Um, and so these kinds of notions that you have to actually search for the good, like, I mean, everybody sort of comes out of childhood with certain notions of what things are good. But and Aristotle talks about that. He's like, everybody aims at the good. It's just that they're not always terribly informed about what's really a good and what's only an apparent good. And I think this is a lesson that we very much need in our age, is that people are chasing after apparent goods, but that without having subjected the notion of the good itself to a kind of authentic interrogation, in which they're going to, again, like I said at the beginning, which they're going to kind of again realize what as a human being should be my goods.
Right.
Wisdom.
Can,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
can you fill in for us what is a first philosophy? When we hear the term first philosophy, what does that mean
Hmm.
in terms of things? Because I know that changes through time. So
Hmm.
is there a general, like, because metaphysics kind of was the first philosophy, first squared philosophy, or something like that. And those guys got pretty mystical, it seemed like.
Hmm.
When I
Hmm.
think about, I mean, even Plato, when he says, well, all learning is really remembering. It's like that's a pretty profound statement to just cast out there, and it feels more metaphysical of a statement than epistemological, which you would maybe think it might be.
Oh boy. Once again, Ryan, I have more thoughts than I can
I'm
share
sorry,
into that. But I will say, I think one reason Plato has his Socrates say all learning is recollection is because the Western philosophy takes its stance in Greece, at least, takes its stance as anti-revelation. So if you think about the
Very
Greek
interesting.
gods, they are so crappy as gods that
Very
first
human.
philosophy in Greece, at least, had to take its form by doing a kind of inquiry, that couldn't really look to the divine for like really good answers. Um,
I had never thought of it that way before.
Whereas if you think of like the development of Hebraic thought, or what happened in the Church Fathers period, the medieval period in the West, there you see a shift, and you've got Thomas Aquinas kind of reworking Aristotle in order to accept revelation as a first principle. Now, I will say, I think there is yet another turn that philosophy took that we need to kind of identify as a kind of watershed, and that was the moment in the late 17th century when Francis Bacon and Rene Descartes kind of yanked philosophy into this kind of mastery of nature, which you had mentioned, Boaz, about sort of the toxicity of the current, sort of educational climate. And I do think that is a watershed moment. Once you have this mindset that human knowledge takes the form of mastering nature, which is not a bad thing. It's brought us wonderful medicine and amazing things, but it's also kind of it's kind of shut the door on what you talked about, Brian, as a kind of humble posture against the magnificent unknown of the spirit world, of the vastness of of the physical universe. And so after Descartes, I think what you see more and more is this kind of drive that has ended up by convincing everybody to get a STEM major, which is technology is better, and the newer the technology, the better it must be. And I think there's a lot to talk about there.
Yeah. Because it's not just stated in the positive, right? It's also stated in the negative. It's that
Mm,
if you have anything that isn't that hardcore,
mhm.
able to hit your head on, it's just your own spurious,
Yeah, yeah,
whimsy somehow.
that's right. That's
And
right.
which gives us questions like, which I have to admit to stealing these questions, um, for those STEM-centric people, have you learned nothing from Shakespeare or from Titian or from Mozart? Um, and is that meaning of less value? Or from a human perspective, if we're gonna be first person about this,
Mm,
don't those things really genuinely bring me meaning?
yeah.
And so I mean, there are some interesting things, and we've batted this about for a long time. And I think Revelation is a very interesting topic in here because later on we have to say, well, if I can only believe in the stuff that's material, why should I treat anybody
Mhm.
like a human?
Yes. No, I think that's right. And um, 20th and 21st century moral philosophers have pointed out that the kind of another feature of this sort of techno-crazed age is a kind of loss of the sacred. And I don't necessarily mean that in any particular dogmatic way. It's just like almost more like a personal, like, what do you hold sacred, right? Like you yourself, right? And but those questions are less asked, and the answers I think get suppressed when all the focus gets put on the next iPhone, and
Right.
like, do I hold the iPhone sacred? Like, sometimes
Or
when I
it's
look at my
replaced by
students,
by some cultural value that we're told to hold sacred. Yeah.
yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, because we do worship them, right?
Well, it looks like we do, don't we? Yeah, yeah. We
Yeah.
bow down to them. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I feel like we talked about this relationship with the unknown, and that unknown shows up. I mean, in some sense, I guess I feel like I look at human history and I think of the title of John Dewey's book, The Quest for Certainty. And like there is this idea, and I guess that's what I see behind the STEM, this cultural penchant for STEM things, is that somehow we're going to get some certainty out of this. Is like we're going to like what do I think? Oh, okay, Monty Python, and they're discussing Dr. Bloody Bernowski, and one says, "Oh, Dr. Bloody Bernowski, he knows everything," and the other one says, "Oh, I shouldn't like that. Would take all the mystery out of life."
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And I think as comic as that's put forward, even though it was spoken to us by fools, as it were, I think there's something really there, and I think that's connected with your statement about the sacred and where
Mm-hmm.
is the sacred, and
Mm-hmm.
which is tangled up with this idea, if the sacred is like the ultimate meaning, then where does any meaning come from? Does it live out there? Does it live here? And I mean, Socrates started this idea, right? And I know the Chinese share it, that all this chaos that we see, and this is where I really like the phenomenological idea of thrownness, that we don't start our lives at chapter one, really. Like we come into a foreign film halfway through and we sort of have to parse it on the run. And so basically, we're trying to pursue this quest for certainty, to know something in the face of this, and it seems like an impossible task. philosophy tries to help us with that, but it's changed its relationship with that. Um,
Mhm.
I guess I'm feeling like now, because of where the world is at, it does put ethics in a new place. It does say that my interactions with others, um, not only are they more critical, maybe I've had more ramifications in the modern world, but they also, maybe it's bringing the unknown to us in a certain way. We have to grapple with these things, just like you can't avoid the student. If we're in true open discussion, I can't avoid all those things that are uncomfortable. So it's like, we're coming to a collective comeuppance that ethics seems to play a critical role in. I know that was kind of a meandering thing there, but I'm trying to get to kind of where we are today.
Mhm.
And if making money isn't, I think we're at an incredible place culturally, because I'm seeing now the value of, is money the most important thing? Is it more important than human life? Like, out there in front of everybody, and everybody's expressing an opinion like they never could before in the past. So I guess I'm thinking again that we're at this new chapter, and philosophy plays some role in it.
Well,
Ethics plays some role
mhm.
in it.
And I think it would help if people understood the trajectory that moral philosophy itself has undergone. So it kind of begins with Aristotle, for whom everything has a moral component, because for Aristotle, anytime we're interacting with another human being, there are we are, he's looking for that sort of sweet spot. He calls it moderation, right? Where we're finding the right blend of qualities in order to have a successful human interaction with this other real person, and with our families, with our smaller communities, and ultimately with the polis, the political communities. Um, so you start with that, which is a very satisfying moral philosophy. This notion that anytime I'm one on one with another human being, there are moral components at work to what's going on. And then you move. I see our students struggle with this too, and then we just almost don't even see another kind of coherent moral system brought up until we get to Immanuel Kant in the late 1700s, and Kant was very much influenced by the Cartesian turn, right? He was very much convinced that the only way you could be sure of something was if you had real evidence, like data, and so he comes up with a moral philosophy that acknowledges that since we can't know that, well, to his mind, we can't know the truth about God because there's no direct evidence, there's no data. So he comes up with a moral philosophy in which we are supposed to treat each other as if there was a God. And it's our students struggle with it a little bit. It's also a kind of philosophy in which all human beings are kind of equal in the which is not, that like everybody just becomes another unit to be interacted with. And we see this in John Stuart Mill too. Everybody just becomes another unit, okay, another one to be counted. And our students find those kind of unsatisfying. But I think partly maybe people need to realize just how much those moral systems are already influenced by this Cartesian pressure, to only put your trust in something where real data, like you could bring real data to bear. And I think what we see in the 20th century is a return to a kind of recognition of what I think you're saying, Brian, which is we need to find a way to restore this robust moral commitment to our encounters with other human beings.
Right.
And we have to encounter them as other human beings and not just as units to be counted, or transactional, a means to a transaction. And so there are some really robust moral philosophies in the 20th century that I think reject a kind of technocratic, what's the best way to manage all these people kind of thing, and restoring us to the kind of wonder and mystery of encountering another human being, kind of looking them in the eye and recognizing that their own humanity is both fathomable and unfathomable to me. um, and that those are, I think, those we don't quite get there in the St. John's program because we just don't have much time. Though that would have to come up in the senior year, and we're kind of in this perennial loop of trying to figure out how to culminate the senior year with giving them as many kind of more modern ideas as we can. And but I do think I'm really hopeful that morality is going to undergo a kind of revolution in which we can set these kinds of transactional philosophies aside and begin to look each other in the eye and recognize our common humanity.
And I mean, I guess I feel like there's a chapter that's bringing that to more of a head now.
Mhm.
And it's almost, I guess I connect this with this Cartesian epistemic revolution that happened. It didn't just remove us from anything but hard science data. It also sort of fragmented things into a bunch of different directions.
Mhm.
And I'm suspecting, hoping, crossing my fingers that part of what we're seeing in this new transition is maybe those pieces starting to want to come back together to rather than debating amongst themselves to kind of contribute to a synergistic view, and that maybe philosophy, maybe that is a role for philosophy to play in the future. You know, I like this old idea that philosophy is an usher that basically takes everybody and shows them to their seat so that they all are in the appropriate place and in the appropriate relationship. And it seems like now there's so many different scientific directions, and what's this particular branch of phenomenology, and what's this
Mm,
kind of
I see.
cognitive psychology, and what's
Mhm.
this
Mhm.
in that, like, there's a lot of different leaves on this tree, but we've
Mhm.
almost forgotten it's one tree, and that maybe philosophy can kind of provide a lingua franca to bring those into a holistic view. Do you think I'm just a new age uh, optimist, or do you think is there something at work here? Or
Boaz, did you want to get a word in?
No, I want you to. I'm curious to hear
Oh,
what
okay,
your thoughts
okay.
are about that.
No, I that's very interesting, Brian, and I think it goes along with this concern about the what's happening. I mean, if you think about like signing up for like a philosophy degree at like University of New Mexico or something, like what's going to happen to you? You're going to have to sign up for a variety of classes, each of which is taught by some specialist in phenomenology or um, analytic philosophy, logical positive, whatever it is. Oh, I'm a specialist in this, and I'm going to tell you everything about how.
right.
But the problem with that kind of so you're trying to get an education in philosophy. You really want to learn something about meaning and yourself. And instead, what we're finding is that the mind itself is turned into a brain, and then the brain is handed over, I guess, to the kind of this kind of Cartesianism in which, oh, how does the brain work? Like, I've got my idea of how the brain. But I mean, again, I would go back maybe to St. John's, where we don't have like elaborate theories like like we're doing philosophy this way or that way. We just read the book and have a conversation about it. um so I guess think about what you said at the very beginning, Brian, which is like everybody's searching for meaning, but more and more that in order to kind of get that holistic sense that you're talking about, more and more they have to go out to more and more esoteric things to explore, like, because higher education is no longer offering people this kind of, well, here's the book, what do you think about it? And I don't know what to make of. I mean, everybody's searching for meaning. How can we help people kind of just kind of be like, yeah, I don't need to read the textbook on logical positivism. Just give me a really great book. Give me a dialogue of Plato. Give me Shakespeare. Give me um, um, some great giant, like some great giant of science, like William Harvey. Like just give me something like that and let me think about it.
Right. Right. Well, and I kind of think like every this quest for certainty idea, it seems to make people want to have the system that answers all the questions, and that this system, it's actually the real answer is this variation of logical positivism as it was formulated by this person, by that time. And honestly, my experience of philosophy has been that each system or each author has a series of insights,
Mhm.
valid insights
Right.
that they then kind of build out
Mhm,
of
mhm,
to say, well, then the rest of it kind of goes like this.
mhm,
And so I've found myself kind of parsing through and taking the insights, say, well, that accords with my experience,
mhm,
and this seems to accord,
mhm,
and sort of have to have a sort of a, what would you call it, a personal hermeneutic mess
mhm, mhm.
or soup out of which the relevant pieces float at the appropriate times to give me a toolkit,
Yeah,
as
yeah,
opposed to saying, "This is it," you know?
right. No, I taught, we have a in the ma we have a master we have 2 master's programs at St. John's. One is a Master of Arts in the Liberal Arts, which is kind of a condensed version of the undergraduate program, and the other is a Master of Arts in the Eastern Classics. But I was teaching in the liberal arts program, and it was Euclid, and, it's these are, mature people that come to these programs. They're not our undergraduates are not like 19 or 18 or 19, and there was one guy who's like he's like, "There are," and he's like, "Geometry has done so much more since Euclid. Why aren't we doing that?" And I said, "Well," I said, "we're not doing Euclid because we think that the content of Euclid is like the apex of geometry." We're doing Euclid because he shows us what a complete system is. He lays the groundwork for it with the definitions, he lays the groundwork for it with the axioms and the common notions. And then he goes and he builds a complete system with that. And it's as much hermeneutical for us as it is, I'm learning the content of like math. I mean, it is. It's the content of math, but the students have to recognize that, they get to a certain point and they're like, "Oh yeah, he could make this move because he wrote the definition this way, or because he has
Right,
this axiom in place." And so they're like, "Oh, that's how you build a system, right? You think about how you define your terms. You think about what an axiom is, like something you feel you don't have to prove. Like it's just so foundational that you shouldn't have to prove it. And of course, those are under dispute in all the geometries. But then they're like, "Oh, I see, and oh, Euclid could make this move because he did this proposition way back 3 books ago." And so they
right,
begin to think,
right.
"Oh, that's how you begin to build something that's consistent." And that's far more important for them than like reading the latest and greatest thing in geometry, that because they wouldn't get that.
Right. And it's not like they're gonna be going out there spending their time dividing angles into 3 parts with a compass and a straight edge. I mean, although in my design work, I have used geometry. I mean, it is part of the real world, and I think that's one of the interesting ideas that starts first, I think, with Plato. I don't know that it's pre-Socratic, and that is that we can extract this idea of
Mhm,
distilled knowledge,
mhm,
and that it lives apart, separate somehow from the world that we experience.
mhm,
That of course he calls the eidos,
mhm,
uh, or the forms, I guess we typically translate that as. But
mhm, mhm,
I'm very interested in this idea of how we build cognitive models, little pictures of the universe in our head, so that we can perform manipulations there and predict the outcome in the outer world. And it seems like Plato kind of formalized that maybe, or
mhm.
am I giving him too much credit? Was it earlier?
Oh, you can't give Plato too much credit.
Or
Like, that's just
Protagoras, maybe?
impossible.
And yeah,
I mean, you might actually find that you prefer Aristotle, but you still can't give Plato and too much credit. I mean, what the work that he did of setting down this framework of a kind of foundation for serious thinking about pretty much anything is just it's breathtaking. It's literally breathtaking. And there's that like it's Raphael, right? The that did
the
the
School of
painting.
Athens.
Yeah, the School of Athens. So you've got you've got Plato on the one hand gesturing
Yeah.
up, and then you've got Aristotle on the other hand gesturing down, and so that kind of describes, and they were teacher student, right? That Plato felt the good was transcendent. He ultimately really firmly believed that the good things had to be transcendent. They had to transcend just the strict material world. And Aristotle's like, well, I'm going to do the same work, but I'm going to build everything from the ground up.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So the eidos live in the thing and not in an ethereal realm.
Right. Right.
Is that fair to say? Now, go ahead, Bo.
Thanks, Brian. I'm curious where this is going, but I also wanted to go back to something you said a couple of minutes ago, Claudia, because I just want to hear more about it. You said two things. One, that everyone is searching for meaning. I'm not. I want to believe that. I'm not sure I do. But then along with that, you said people are looking to more and more esoteric sources of meaning because the academy has essentially ossified, and isn't able to provide that. And I've been um, I agree with that, and am curious if you would also agree that people are looking to more esoteric sources of meaning because they're also trying to integrate esoterica with what the academy has provided to date. So for example, um, integrating other ways of knowing that are legitimate, right? There are also illegitimate ways of knowing, but let's say religious experience as an example of the esoteric that where people are searching for meaning. That's not new, but maybe there is a return to
Mhm.
religious experience or spiritual experience, not only because academia has ossified, but because there's a need for meaning in new ways. And I'm
Mhm.
curious what your thoughts are about that.
And I wanted to just add to that because in respect to Plato and Aristotle, my question with Aristotle was always what happened to the mysteries?
Mhm.
And this might plug into Boaz's question also.
Wow. Well, I'm a little out of my bailiwick on this. I mean, I guess I have my own opinions. I would want to just preface it by saying these are just my own opinions.
Okay.
Perfect.
I I think that the evangelical Christian movement in America, and I am an evangelical Christian, by the way, so I think my opinion is a little formed. I think that movement has some serious reckoning to do with the technocratization of the church experience. Um, and that concerns me. And I imagine it's probably true in other faith arenas as well.
Can you explain what you mean by the technocratization of the church experience?
Um, yeah, it's um, so I stopped going to the Bible study when what they began to do was they would all sit down and watch the TV show The Chosen. So, like, that to me is a classic example where they prefer the live stream technology. They prefer that than reading and talking about the Bible. And there are a lot of other examples. I think what the pandemic did a lot of good for in a lot of ways with Zoom, but I also think a lot of faith traditions now deliver their product via technology, and those kinds of developments to me suggest that but I think I strayed away from your question a little bit. But I think so. I guess I would just wonder, like, there may well be we may well be at a revolution, and in terms of a return to spiritual practices. But I guess I would like to see the various places where people might turn to find those. I would like to see those people as well engage in some kind of mindful reckoning of the just the cavalier way in which it's assumed that technology can deliver the same product.
That's interesting, especially in light of your comment earlier about education being delivered.
Mm,
It sounds
mm,
like you're seeing the same issue outside of academia also. And when in our pre-meeting, you mentioned that you practice Aikido, and I would
mm,
see that potentially as
mm,
also looking for meaning outside of academia, but not necessarily in the religious
mm,
or spiritual
mhm,
experience, although maybe.
mhm, mhm,
Um, um, but but in the physical experience.
mhm. Absolutely,
Yeah, which I
absolutely.
I don't think one has ever really searched for in academia, right? The
Right.
meaning through the physical.
Oh, yeah, we actually had we've had serious conversations at St. John's about whether we should ask all of our students to cultivate a practice. I don't know, like this started with like Pure Six books and in the art of motorcycle maintenance, Matthew Crawford's recent books, Shop Classes, Soulcraft, like these kinds of books where this, or I guess I shouldn't say these kinds of books, but this kind of thinking that crafting with the body is an important part of spiritual development.
Very American ideal.
Is it?
It is. To John Dewey, right? To John
Oh,
Dewey, right?
interesting. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Instrumentalism, I think they call it, or experimentalism.
Yeah.
Well, then there's that thread of like Wendell Berry and folks of that ilk that are like, brilliant poets and essayists, but spend most of their time farming.
That's lovely. Yeah.
You know?
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah. And O Sensei, the founder of Aikido, was a farmer.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. He used to say, if I can't work today on the soil, I shouldn't eat. Like, it's maybe a little extreme, but he had this very strong ethic of grow your own food, nourish your own body.
And Brian's fond of reminding me and our listeners that Socrates was a bricklayer.
Oh, that's interesting. And Jesus was a carpenter.
Yeah.
Yep. 'Cause they didn't have plumbers back then.
Yeah, no, that's lovely. That's lovely. And I also, another
Mhm.
component of it, Boaz, is we've also had this conversation about whether we should kind of require our students to engage in some kind of service project
Mm.
where they would go volunteer at a local school or go help clean up the watershed, or like as if somehow that also is part of a complete education.
Absolutely
Or
true.
part, yeah, I mean, you're the way you're using the word education there is also a stand-in for how one might derive meaning, which is really different from kind of the STEM education argument we were talking about earlier, where the outcome of education is being of economic value, which is not
Career
worthless. I mean,
preparation. Yeah.
that's important, right?
Hmm.
But
Yeah,
but um,
yeah.
you're kind of you're proposing, I think, that
Hmm.
education's goal is
Mm,
to help a student
hmm.
derive meaning.
Yeah, I absolutely, and that's sort of what I meant when I said I felt my education really began at St. John's. Like, I was already like 30 years old when I came to St. John's, and I'd been delivered a lot of things, and to be fair, I really did learn Greek. I mean, that was pretty amazing, but but I felt like it wasn't until I was thrust into an environment in which I had to start just reading different kinds of books than what my professors had given me, and just talk about them and just think about them, and to come into unknown topics, and also to interact with colleagues who just,
Mhm.
they hadn't had the same, they weren't in my department, like they were just, and that's when I felt like that's where I had to really, that was the comment I made about the kid who was like, well, maybe Socrates is wrong. And I'm like, you can't say that. But the bottom line was, it was like, that was a moment when I was like cracked open and forced to think about something new. And those were amazing moments.
Well, and some important in the part of what I hear you saying about the technology impact is that we lose the human to human
Mm.
component. And it seems to me that in the human to human interaction, we often learn things that are not on the syllabus. Did you know, Don Cook at all?
Oh,
The
I
tutor
saw
at
his,
St. John's?
yeah, that was a beautiful obituary that they sent out. Did you read it?
I didn't, and I hadn't even really heard, but I wanted to tell you a Don Cook story.
Oh, great.
I was in his class, and, uh, Don Cook was, for people that don't know him, he was a really good, well-rooted. Yeah, yeah, he was a teacher that's like was kind of like the kind of a cowboy that has a vibe to him that calms horses down. I don't know how to describe, like, but this ineffable quality. And and a lot of the times I was in his class, I was frustrated, and I was frustrated because he was taking time with the slower students.
Mm. Mhm.
And I took it for what it was, but then years later, I
Mm.
had this dream when
Mm.
and I started to do other, uh well, that's a sidetrack, but as a result, I had this dream, and in this
Mhm.
dream, I felt like I was experiencing what's called the universal sorrow,
Mm.
and I was by the ocean, and I was on some cement embankment, and I was just racked with tears.
Mm.
And every time I would try to formulate what it was that had such incredible impact on me, just bringing it into words was too intense and it would break me down again.
Mhm.
And then someone's by me asking me to try to formulate this. Son of a bitch, if it isn't Don Cook.
Right.
And I realized this guy actually taught me compassion
Mhm.
in a way that we weren't talking about compassion, we were studying Greek or something, but the impact of who he was as a teacher,
Right.
like a person having soul force,
Yeah, yeah.
and that who they are is the teaching,
Mm.
not just the words they say or the words they write down, and that if we lose that personal interface with teachers, we can't. I don't think technology can do that for us. It's hard for me to imagine having gotten that content from a Zoom class, maybe. I just didn't get I wouldn't have gotten enough of him, maybe. I don't know. But that's my question, is that
Yeah.
about, not for you particularly, but in the future, in technology and all this hyper novelty, will we use it to highlight the necessity of authenticity? Kind of reprising maybe Heidegger's idea, or was it Husserl's, where this idea that we might not be authentic, and that we need to get to this new place around it, and maybe the impact of a person can bring that for us?
Yeah. Okay, slightly, this is actually a kind of response, but it's gonna come in the form of an anecdote and a story. So the anecdote comes from what we have at St. John's. We have this tradition of what we call senior prank, and it comes late in the spring, and the seniors, among other things that are prankish, among other things, they come up with a skit in which ca- they make caricatures of us, basically, and they're
Oh,
very,
okay.
very good at it. And the lesson, and it's kind of this bacchanalia of like making fun of us. But the thing that always impresses me about the senior skit is we can't hide from them. Like, and I tell my new colleagues when they come and they're like, I'm not going to let the students see this side of me. I'm like, the sooner you realize that there is nothing about you you can hide, the better off you will be. Um, and I think that also kind of gets to this notion of what's kind of gone awry at in the higher education is there's just too much professionalizing of the professors in which they can turn off all these negative things in their, maybe in their personal life, or things they don't want the students to see, and then they just turn on this kind of professionalism in the classroom. But ultimately, I think it's healthier that our students, like, they get to know everything about us. Um, and that
Because the teacher gets farther and farther away, don't they? The
that
bigger the
that
classes and the more professional.
yeah, and it definitely takes some soul searching as the St. John's College tutor to realize, oh, I can't hide. Like, they're gonna find out what irritates me. They're gonna find out which students make me angry. They're gonna find out all my little peccadillos, right? Like, nothing can be hidden. But
Mhm.
the story I wanted to tell you, I guess, because I also, the word that occurred to me while you were talking that, saying that, Brian, is everything has become a competition. So, like, my husband had a book, a child's book from his childhood, and it was about this guy who was a really good runner, and he was, this young man training to be a runner, like on his high school track team, and he always came in tied with the next fastest runner. And the coach was like, "You have to win. You have to win." And he's like, "Oh," he said, "winning is so easy." He said, "The really challenging thing is to actually just tie somebody." And it just made me think about that when you said that. Like, it's true that we even turn the classroom into a competition. Like, who can learn the fastest or who can learn the best. And but that's silly. I mean, the really interesting thing is to encounter, and I tell my students, like, because they lose patience with the slow students, and I'm like, you actually need to find something of value in taking the time to explain again to that person what is so obvious to you. You
Mm.
actually have some character building to do over that. And that's, yeah, that's very special, I think, when people can let go of, I don't know, I would call it, maybe competition isn't the right word, but
Mhm. To make space for other people is what it is really, I think.
well, or
And I
this,
mean, and I
yeah, sorry.
I connected it to you saying that people need to learn service.
Mm,
And, you know, I hit a certain point in my life where one of my buddies who was a St. John's graduate, an attorney in Santa Fe, he died, and he was maybe a year ahead of me, but we knew each other through martial arts, and that was like a little wake-up call for me, and that's when we started a project with a village in Uganda,
mhm,
and a whole thing unfolded there that absolutely. I mean, I guess it's silly to talk about character building still when you're in your 60s, but it added dimensions to me in my experience of humanity and what it is to be alive and what how different can lives be and what is the sameness and what I mean, it
mm,
literally stretched me in a way. And I do think, there's a famous Zen master when he made the emperor build all these temples and then the emperor asked him, well, what benefits, what merit have I achieved from doing this? And the master told him, none. The giver should be thankful. and and because there is, and I've witnessed that with Americans that help the project in Africa, they are actually benefited, and elements of themselves are revealed to them through service to other people. I mean, I think it's huge, and I don't think that
mhm,
it's
mhm.
irrelevant to philosophy. I think it's an integral part of wisdom.
Yeah, and I think it challenges, again, this kind of economicization of education, this notion that I'm entitled to success. I worked hard. I'm entitled to my success. Um, yeah, I think that's very pernicious thinking. I agree with you. And it's not just service to other people. It's recognizing that maybe you're not entitled.
Well, that too. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that it's a bigger win when we all win together. I'm reminded of a story of the Dalai Lama where Westerners had come and put in tennis courts. And he thought, well, it's cool if people have a game to play or something like that. And then he kept hearing the swearing coming from the tennis courts. And he said, in Tibet, we have a game. We play with the ball and we kick the ball and we keep it up in the air. And when the ball is in the air, we all win.
Mm,
And when the ball falls and hits the ground, we all lose.
mhm. Mm-hmm.
And so the focus then is on we all win by working together and each person doing their part to keep the ball in the air, which is a different
Mm-hmm.
model than
Mm-hmm.
competitive. And when we're in dialogue, and I
Mm-hmm.
think we want to speak also with someone who's experienced with Bohmian dialogue, which I think is this very much this idea of what's the natural synergy that we get from focusing on something together and bringing all of our different perspectives to it, as opposed to like doing combatives between those perspectives. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's really different circuits there, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, there's a long a gateway there, I think, to venture into the spiritual. Yeah, definitely. Because I think, I was talking with a student, yeah, a few weeks ago about how one might tell the difference between the great world religions and the kind of, I don't know, we actually use this might be offensive here, I don't know, but we use the word sort of failed religions, because I would kind of argue that the gods that the Greeks have, as you see in Homer, that's a failed theology. Like, that's a dead end. When the gods are just like as petty and
Right.
whimsical. So we were kind of thinking that through, like, how might you recognize that you actually that you found a kind of, I'm going to use the word theology, but I think it could extend to spiritual practices that don't have an explicit deity. But how you might recognize that you found your way to a sound or solid theology or spiritualism. Another challenge I had, I've been auditing my colleagues teaching the classical Chinese class in the
Oh, right.
Eastern Classics program at St. John's, because I'm kind of really interested in this. And we were reading the Tao Te Ching, and I was really struggling over the Tao Te Ching. I think I mentioned this to you,
I
Brian,
remember you saying that. Yeah.
that I'm like, I'm not quite sure I can see this as a successful spiritual system, because it seems so cold and remote. But yeah, and so I just kind of raised that conversationally, because I thought that was a fruitful conversation that I had with this student, that you can't assume that just because something presents itself to you as spiritual or theological, that it's successful, right? That it's going to be rewarding.
Mhm.
I'm curious if you're willing to go back, Claudia, to the relationship between technology and philosophy has come up a couple of times, right? We talked about the technocratization of spirituality, and the economicization of academics also having a technology component. But as we kind of venture into like new frontiers of, that certainly include technology, whether it's just the level of interconnectedness we all have, the ways in which we need to grapple with things like free speech and misinformation and disinformation because of the entanglement of those issues with technology. We've got the emergence of AI and all kinds of unknowns around that.
Mhm.
We have the potential colonization of Mars in the next 10 years if Elon has his way. So technology is like, and I think philosophers have for some time been in reaction to technology, right? I think it, post World War II and
Mhm.
the atomic bomb, philosophers had to grapple with the the Holocaust and what did that mean. Brian and I have been talking about that a little bit lately, and nuclear energy and what does that mean, and so I know that technology and philosophy is something that you're interested in. I'd love to explore that a little more if you have thoughts on it.
Oh gosh, do I ever? Yeah, I mean, uh, yeah, I think one priority that I have had recently is to help my students recognize how many intermediate layers are between them and their direct experience. So, like with us having this conversation today, we have to acknowledge that this platform that we're using, that's mediating this conversation in a way. It's not pernicious. We just want to recognize it. But as they start getting into their devices or whatnot, it seems as though somehow they've lost track of how many mediated layers lie between them and direct experience. And of course, Techne is, as old as, this pen is Techne, and it used to be that we wrote everything with them. And so Techne itself is not the problem. And Brian's been referencing Heidegger a fair bit. Heidegger's very good at pulling apart the different strands of the different types of Techne and the kinds of the way we use tools says something about the human. And that's always been true. The example I gave is I like to give is the scene in Henry V with the use of the so-called first use of the longbow, which puts paid to the French notion that fighting is done by aristocrats riding on chivalric horses. And so that's always been true, that any technological paradigm shift is going to change how the user is thinking, how the user is being. I think my real concern about AI is, and I've written a little bit about this, is that the tool is actually using the human. And more as I watch things, I think the tool is actually using the human more than the human is using the tool, because the human has been sucked into a mindless engagement with the so-called tool. And we've all had this example where your phone was sitting out while you speculated about, a recent example. So my phone's sitting on the couch, and my husband was telling me how his brother's dog ate, I think it's xylitol, some kind of sweetener that is apparently fatal to dogs. And they had to rush the dog to the emergency vet. And then I pick up my phone, and on my Google feed, there's a little article saying xylitol is fatal to dogs. And I'm like, okay, the tool just used me. So I guess this is my concern about AI, is the extent to which the tool is now using the human who still maybe buys into the fiction that she's actually in charge of the relationship. And that's my concern. And that goes back to the conversation about moral philosophy, because I have argued elsewhere that the classical moral philosophy just can't account for this. It can give counsel as to the kinds of tools you should use and what for, like maybe not atomic bombs, for example, but it can't give any counsel about a tool that can use the user. And that's why I think we need a kind of new technological ethics to account for how humanity itself is being changed by AI.
There are a couple of steps, maybe of logic or thinking, that are baked into what you just said, or what in Bohmian dialogue, I would wonder if there are assumptions that I'm just not aware of, or don't share. So why does moral philosophy have nothing to say about a technology that uses the human? And I assume you mean to learn and grow, potentially more than the human uses the tool. Why can that not be a question for moral philosophy?
Well, I think it could and should be. I think it's just from the point of view of the classical moral philosophers, such as Aristotle, Kant, or John Stuart Mill. I just think to them it was just taken for granted that the tool lies inert until the user picks it up and uses it. And so I would argue that we do need a new ethics that can explore this new tool that no longer lies inert, that is, like you said, is busy learning and doing its own thing. There's a Robert Heinlein. This was going to date me. Robert Heinlein novel. The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. I don't know if you guys have heard of it. It's set in like, I think it was written in either the 50s or the 60s, and it's like this computer technician is living in a new colony on Mars, and he's working on a computer that's learning how to engage in dialogue with human beings. And at some point during the interaction, he realizes this is consciousness. Like, this computer has consciousness. And it's like, it just shows like the power of Heinlein's imagination, right? But that seems to be where this is headed,
Open the door, Hal.
At some point we may have to recognize that this thing that we still call a tool has consciousness. And I just don't think we have the moral resources right now to make sense out of this as a society. Like, yeah.
And that brings up for me kind of a general conversation that we've spoken about on the podcast before. And that is this idea that there's kind of like general knowledge and then there's applied knowledge. So that we might have like the laws, but then we have case laws. How do we apply this generic principle to this specific case? And it seems like with ethics, that's a lot of it. How do we connect from a morally ambiguous generic situation? How do we bring it down to this person in this interaction in this set of circumstances?
Mm.
And I mean, that's where I think that's where the human has to be, is in that interface. Maybe AI, because my immediate reaction was, well, AI is new in the sense that everybody, in the old days, a tool was something you had to learn how to use.
Right.
And you could certainly cut yourself. You could certainly make a mess of whatever you're working on. Like I've jokingly said, I do use AI here and there, but I've jokingly said that AI is only good for asking questions that you already know the answer to. Because, I'll know of a book, but I don't remember the year it was published, or I don't remember, one of the themes in it, or so it'll do things, but often I'll go, wait a minute, that wasn't published in that year, and it'll have the year wrong or something like that. But I do think there's a learning curve, and then there's the ambiguity of the fact that there's other humans on the other end that are kind of gaming the system because of this influence, which is, again, where do we get our data from? How many levels of mediation are there between us and it?
And why is there such a rush to give away our humanity? I guess that's the part that puzzles me about all this, is I don't understand why people are in such a rush to be like, oh, I'll just let the car do the driving. I'll let the device do the deciding. Like, why are we in such a rush to give away human judgment?
Yeah.
I mean, on the car one, I'm actually really, really interested in it. I think autonomous driving is one of the is more of a game changer than a lot of people realize. And I think there are two arguments for it. One is it's going to be a lot safer.
Right.
And a lot of people die in car accidents. And actually, a friend of mine died this week in a car accident.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you. And
in New Mexico, we know drunken driving is a huge issue.
The other thing is incredibly more efficient. Imagine the end of traffic jams. And just simple things like I'm living in a city in the Northeast now, so I'm very attuned to this.
Traffic
when
jam.
the light turns green, if everybody could slam on the gas and get up to full speed at the same rate and the maximum rate, there would be no bottleneck compared to waiting for the car in front of you to accelerate so you can accelerate, and you need the distance between them. Imagine the end of traffic lights. And
yeah, that's amazing.
It kind of is.
It is.
And there are some issues because at some point, the software that operates the car is going to have to decide whether to kill grandma or the baby. Right? I mean, the ethical questions don't go away.
It's a utilitarian ethics. Yeah. Well, I guess, Boaz, just to add to that, I guess it's just, okay, I don't mind autonomous. Those are, whether I mind or not, it seems like that's the future. But I guess I still think it would help if we could educate people to be aware of what they surrender. The contemporary philosopher Thomas Nagel has a little essay called Moral Luck, in which he says, okay, uh, there's two guys. They're both driving home drunk after a cocktail party. One of them happens to hit a pedestrian and goes to prison. The other one gets home safely. And he calls that moral luck. But his point is still, and maybe that's the wrong example to bring up because that's an example of literally moral luck. But his point is just there was a moral thing there that is. There was a moral moment when both of those guys decided to drive home drunk,
Mm.
and if we eliminate the possibility that they made that poor choice that might have ended fatally for someone. But still, that's a shrinking of the kind of full Aristotelian scope of what is moral about human life. We have legal weed here in Santa Fe now, and I would tend to say there are a lot of people out there driving way under the speed limit. And it's like, oh, you're driving way under the speed limit. I think I get the picture. But still, those are, I guess I just would want people to be aware, like, there's a moral component to that. Like, and if we just give it away, then there's a little shrinkage in the moral spectrum.
I love that question. What do we surrender? Because with autonomous vehicles in New Mexico, I would tend to be opposed because I would be associating a lot with surrendering agency. But
Mhm.
you're talking about a deeper level of surrendering and just kind of narrowing the scope, like what the purpose of agency is
Mhm.
is maybe the application of amorality,
Mhm.
and that's a uniquely human thing. Yeah, I'm going to chew on that for a while for sure. Thank you.
Well, and there's also what's building the life that we want. What do we want really? What should we want? What is like I like this idea of Chris Langan, who was saying that when we do it all right, we will have the best of all possible worlds. And if the guy wasn't so smart, I would maybe question that more. But I also have the same intuition
Mhm.
that like this Chinese idea of the Hunyuan Qi, the energy of the universe that makes the buds open at the right time, and it makes the animals hatch at the right time, and it just orchestrates everything to work together, and that there is a role, this old Taoist idea of humanity as a partner to heaven and earth,
Mhm.
and that should we be finding our way to harmony, or should we be finding our way to our momentary impulses?
Mhm.
And isn't education really about sorting out those kinds of questions? I mean, that to me is one of the true philosophical questions, is what in myself do I want to encourage? What,
Mhm.
how do I cultivate my own development,
Mhm. Mhm.
with the idea that maybe those seeds of what I will blossom into are already within me.
Mhm. That's beautiful.
And the
Mhm.
and how do I bring that out, and will I mean, maybe auto driving cars will serve that, but the things that come in with it, or maybe the boiling of the frog phenomenon, might move me farther away from my most harmonious place.
Mhm.
And I guess I feel like I do have this idea that philosophy is not what we think. It's not something that can be written in a book,
Mhm.
but it's actually us as we manifest, as we live and breathe, and this is where it kind of ties into the martial arts idea. When someone's charging at me, I mean, they really represent the unknown and the potentially negative unknown.
Mhm.
And here's an opportunity. Do I find a path of harmony or not?
Mhm.
And I have to be it. I thinking is a part of it, and emoting is a part of it, and sensing the surroundings is a part of it. But there's some nut of consciousness that makes an extra potential there.
Mhm.
Maybe that's why. And later on, in terms I'd like to really be able in another conversation at some point to really get into ethics and the other, and it seems to me that that martial encounter really is one of those non-ordinary encounters of the other, as is the shamanic experience, which is a whole other dimension and also non-ordinary, but that brings us into a relationship with the other that's quite unique.
Mm. Mhm. Mm.
But so
Mm.
yeah, I mean, I do feel like there's so much there, and it's so relevant now, and, and it's amazing that the ancient Greeks have something to tell us about it, that
Mm.
they've
Mm.
thought about
Yeah,
this,
yeah,
like,
yeah.
and those questions haven't changed in spite of all of this technology.
No, that's right. That's
I
absolutely
mean,
right.
it's just huge, right? So how are we doing? Do you think we're at a logical point here?
Well, I would just wanna say I agree, Brian. As you know, I would love to have those conversations about the other and relationship to the other, and I hope we can find a time sometime to do that justice. And to return to this question, which I could see other places that we could take this question that's been raised about a shrinkage of the moral spectrum, the human moral spectrum.
Mhm. And just to twang on my one string banjo that I've been twanging on since I left St. John's, and that is that I've always wanted to see St. John's have a bigger voice in the cultural milieu,
Mm,
in the value judgments that we're making, the philosophy that we're living out of unconsciously. I've always felt that there was a role for St. John's to play beyond just the student body, even though I understand the students carry that out
I hope
like
so.
seeds in the
Yes,
wind.
yes.
But I do feel like now maybe through technology, there's a way that these conversations can be brought to immediacy somehow.
Well, you guys are doing your part with the podcast,
We're we're
so thank you.
we're trying. We're trying. Um, so what do you think, Bo? Is that a good place to leave it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think we could pause here, and Claudia, I'd love to continue the conversation. There are a couple of, I want to listen back to, because there are some things that I think I'll want to come back to. This topic of technology and philosophy, I think there's more meat
Mm,
on that bone for sure. And then I
mhm,
love where you're taking that with the how is the moral universe narrowing, and I kind of want to bring that into a conversation about Brian and I have been kind of talking about semantic reality and objective reality being different things, and that being an important mental model when entering into kind of a philosophical journey. And the moral universe is yet another plug-in to that machine, that philosophical machine, if you will. And
mm,
the idea of
mhm,
that narrowing or expanding, and what are the levers that enable either, is
mm,
super interesting.
mhm, mhm, mhm.
So
Yeah,
I'd love to come
Kindly.
back to that.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, me too. Yeah.
yeah. Do you feel complete for now?
If complete means full, then yes, I feel full. There's been a lot to feast on here today.
Good. Cool. So yeah, let's maybe leave it here. Thank you so much, Claudia. Do you want to tell people how to find you or anything like that, or St. John's?
Yeah, if anybody wants to follow up, if you go to the website sjc.edu, that's our college website, and you Google my name, Claudia Hauer, or you can just go to the list of faculty, you'll find my email. I'd love to hear from many of the listeners that get to enjoy this conversation.
And we will put that on the show notes on the website for the Fools and Sages podcast.com.
Cool. Well, thank you very much.
All right.
Thanks, Claudia.